Welcome to our next session of the Association for Mormon Letters Conference. In this session, we will be honoring Michael Hicks, who will be presented with the Lifetime Achievement Award. Michael is a composer, performer, and music scholar, fields in which he is highly respected. Beyond this, he has also made full use of his remarkable writing skills, producing highly engaging music scholarship, history, essays, poetry, religious commentary, and memoir.
Lifetime Achievement Award. Michael is a composer, performer,
and you have YouTube on,
in which he's highly respected. Beyond this, he's also made full use of his remarkable writing skills, highly engaging music scholarship, poetry, religious commentary, and memoir. You have YouTube on.
Oh, sorry.
So yeah, if you have the YouTube stream on, make sure you turn it off.
Sorry.
Okay, our turn. Okay. And we're also joined by, we're joined by Michael and joined by Lance Larsen, who will be interviewing him, talking about Michael's career. There's going to be an award citation that we will publish on our website. Let me read from a little bit of it. I won't read the whole thing, but it'll be available on the AML website. One of his colleagues wrote, "Michael Hicks is a perfect choice for the AML Lifetime Achievement Award. I can't think of anyone living who has contributed more verse and prose in terms of titles, breadth, depth, ideas, or soul to Mormon letters, not to mention music theory and history, than Michael. His writing on important American musical pioneers Henry Cowell and Christian Wolfe is foundational and definitive, as is his writing on Mormon music history. His writing is cited so much because he is so often the first to delve into the many ripe conceptual and factual lacunae, I should look that up, lurking or in open sight in Mormonism and music. Moreover, his scholarly prose is among the best in its clarity, economy, wit, and forward momentum, which is unusual and commendable in the field. His worldly commendations, publications, and recognition are staggering. But creativity in the realms of words, sounds, and images find their ways into uncurated spaces with equal prolificity, generosity, and profundity. He was an early adopter of Facebook and has a large and loyal following on that medium. He uses it effectively and creatively to share political and religious insight, humor, music, anecdotes, art, but most poignantly for many of us, poetry, especially the Psalm series. All of Michael's work is imbued with the soul and skill of a poet, and these are most potently evident in the Psalms, each of which, incredible for how many there are, has its own unique color, rhythm, and insight. It's hard to locate their point of view in the two dimensions of the written word they employ. These writings uplift while introducing new puzzles, while confirming and reconciling us to the unsolvableness of the old ones. Michael has authored 9 books on a wide variety of musical and literary themes, all of which are enriched by his careful scholarship and enlivened by his droll wit. He is the premium scholar of Mormon music history, producing 3 significant works: Mormonism and Music, a History, which won awards from both the MHA and AML, the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, a biography, and Spencer Kimball's record collection, Essays on Mormon Music. Immensely readable and sparkling with fascinating anecdotes, they are some of the most enjoyable history books of Mormonism ever produced. His other music scholarship is written in the same spirit, covering a wide range of spirits, well beyond the classical canon. They include 60s rock, garage, psychedelic, and other satisfactions, and 2 studies of avant-garde composers, Henry Cowell and Christian Wolfe. Recently, he has been publishing more personal work. The street legal version of Mormon's book is an insightful and humorous rewritten adaptation of the Book of Mormon that won an AML award. Do Clouds Rest? Dementia Ventures with Mom is a short collection of funny, sad, and thoughtful essays about his mother's final 8 months of life with dementia. His 2002 memoir, Wineskin, Freaking Jesus in the 60s and 70s, tells the story of his upbringing in a traditional conservative family, then being part of a Jesus freak movement in the 70s, and his conversion to the LDS faith, his missionary experience, excommunication, and return, all full of honest and vulnerable sharing of his own struggles with doubt, questioning, and ultimately transformation. This award honors Michael's lifetime of literary work. We look forward to more of his words of wisdom and expressions of empathy in the future, whether as psalms, folk songs, chamber music, or however he chooses to express himself. Okay, I'll turn things over to Lance.
I want to meet this guy. It sounds interesting. Oh, hey, Lance.
Hey, it's great
Nice
to see
you.
sort of.
With the great, some of Jackie's work behind you.
Yes, it
Nice.
helps to have an artist in family.
Yeah,
You
indeed.
don't have to have any of those fake backgrounds. I think in lieu of an interview, we could actually just do a quick tour of your attic space right there and have you explain, some of the paraphernalia, Americana there.
You don't see the half of it, trust me.
Yeah, I'm sure. I was just going to say, when did we first meet? Do you remember? It was in class you took from me
I
around 20
I
years
kind of
ago?
wanted to start with that because it actually illuminates a little bit of discussion to follow.
Sure.
We met in 2002.
Okay.
So, gosh, 21 years ago. And do you recall how?
I don't. I think I remember you petitioning to take my class, and maybe I was a little bit skeptical because I've had experience with other professors taking classes, and they would fizzle out briefly. I mean, within just a few weeks. So that's my recording.
Well, I want to bring it up. First of all, the way I met you was I phoned you up because I had been at the DI and going through books, and whenever I run across an interesting poetry book or other kinds of books, of course, I pull it out and I'm roaming through Erasable Walls, your first book, I believe, right? And I thought, boy, this is good. This is just exactly the voice that speaks to me. And most of the time I don't buy poetry books that I run across, but this one really got to me, and I took it home. I was reading it. I thought, where's this guy from? And I look at the back, and it's like, oh, he teaches at Brigham Young University, which is where I was teaching, of course, at that time. And I thought, oh, I need to meet this guy. So I called you up and was telling you, I love this book. And we conversed, and then I sent you, I think like the February of 2003, early in 2003, I sent you a sheaf of my poems in a collection called Faith Healing, which you responded to very kindly and then made some suggestions. And so that sort of kicked off this ongoing poetic conversation between us. And here we are 20 plus years later, continuing it.
I actually had forgotten that part of the story. I remember you
Well, you're too modest.
to take my class, and it became apparent within just a few weeks that you were not of the usual fare, let's say. And what I would add to that conversation is, after a terrific semester and some really accomplished work, I think it was just a couple of years later, we lost a member of, that sounds really ominous, a member of my writing group, the writing group that I belonged to, dropped out, and we needed another party. And so I ran your work by the other people in the group, and we said, yeah, let's bring Michael in. So this was not a matter of, oh, it would be good for him. We reasoned it would be good for us. And so he became a full-fledged member of our writing group for what, 5 or 6 years?
Something like that, yeah.
So.
You know, I said that I wanted to mention that encounter with you initially to pave the way into maybe a path that pertains to getting this award, which has, it may raise some questions for some people. I'm a music professor. I don't have English degrees, and haven't been on an English faculty or taught an English class of any kind, which are usually some of the barnacles, if not handmaidens of such awards. But the thing is, I was attracted to your work without any reference to Mormonism in a sort of ghettoized, compartmentalized sense. It was like, this is good. I was thinking of Alan Gerganis had an interview this past week in, I think in the New York Times, and he refers to William Maxwell, the great editor from the New Yorker, I think, for years, and renowned editor. And he says Maxwell was a martyr to quality. I love that. He was a martyr to quality. And so if you look at the phrase Association for Mormon Letters, you can accentuate the Mormon part. And unfortunately, I think that may be done too much in the pursuits of various sessions and so on, Association for Mormon Letters. And I think, well, first of all, I hope that this recognition for me reflects a little more emphasis on the letters part. Association for Mormon Letters. The Mormon is in there, but I hope that there is a little bit of martyrdom to quality in it, that there is a recognition of quality there. I'm not, let's say, I'm a somewhat failed believer, but an adequate saint. I'll put it that way. I mean, I'm a very active member of the church and love the work that I'm able to do right now, serving at Jamestown, a branch here, assisted living, and play the piano for them and do lots of musical types of things and so on. But I think that, excuse me, that my encounter with your work is perfect for how I want to understand Mormon letters. And as I used to say to my classes sometimes, I'd say Mormonism, i.e. the universe, because from my platform and dive into Mormonism, it was into suddenly the expansiveness of all of it, which is populated by quality, and where the stars and the planets are all things to explore different versions of excellence. When I joined the church as a young adult, they put me right into the Pursuit of Excellence program. You know, you have to fill out the goals and so forth. And that was the essence of Mormonism to me, road shows and so on, I think from a saintly point of view. So theology, I love it. And if the church, which is an island in the sea of Mormonism, they wouldn't put it that way, I'm sure, but if how do I put this? The church is, to me then and to me now, not to everyone, about authority and pioneering. You boil down the Mormon church to those things, and I still hold to that. And the pioneering part is often absent, at least in the pioneering sense that your work is and was to me, and what I wish my work to always be, whether it's in composition or performance or prose poetry, writing liner notes, or even editing a journal. That pioneering sense is there, has to be a handmaiden, I think, to authority.
I like that. That's great.
So that's how we met.
Maybe in a similar vein, I remember often quoting to students in my class the poet Rita Dove, who happens to be African American.
Yeah.
And when people would talk to her about race in her poetry, she says, I don't want to be considered a hyphenated poet, right?
Mm-hmm.
She wants to be a poet first and maybe only, who happens to write sometimes about race. And I would say the same thing about Association of Mormon Letters or Mormon poetry, whatever. I just always want to emphasize the noun and let the adjective complicate things a little bit and perhaps provide a convenient gathering point, but I don't want that to be the basis of the conversation.
Yeah, so. Very good. Yeah, and the hyphenated is interesting because to me, Mormonism is, the Mormon letters is the Mormon is saying this is good stuff. I think of I remember Paul McCartney talking about when he first encountered Jimi Hendrix. He was in a club. Jeff and Beckett invited him to a club in England. So this is before any recordings of Hendrix had come out. And he was playing, and McCartney tells the story, and he puts his finger to his mouth, and he goes, this is good. and and so I love those kinds of experiences that I have with literature of many of the writers that I encounter in AML. I want to have that experience of, this is good. This is good.
Yeah.
And good is an underrated word, but it seemed to work well for I don't know, the creator, the front end of the Book of Genesis, right? He saw it was good. I mean, what? There's no higher value,
Right.
you know. Plato and all, Aristotle, you know, they're investigating, what does that mean? What is the good and the beautiful? And Keats, of course, says that, you know, put them together. That's all you need to know.
Excellent. Well, I do want to instantiate this conversation a little
Sure.
bit with some specifics from your work. Maybe a good
Sure.
place to start would be Wineskin. Let me just repeat the title. There's a lot in there. It's packed. Wineskin, Freaking Jesus in the 60s and 70s. This is a memoir that appeared last year, I guess, from Signature.
Yeah.
Could you, in a nutshell, maybe tell us a little bit about the title, or how you came to write this, or he came to write it right now? And I'm going to go grab my copy, but go ahead and answer.
Sure. So the title, first of all, we're all taught to commanded, as it were, to write a personal history. And there's that part of it. It's like, okay, I've never really done that, but I want to do it in a way that really gets into the shaping of my religious identity. There's tons of stuff that I didn't include in there that I could, of more savory, but mostly less savory aspects. But there's that. It was prompted a little bit by our older son saying, probably 10 years ago, he said, so this was in a very private, enclosed space when he was living in California, working for Apple. We visited him, and he says, so I understand you were excommunicated at one point and came back to the church. Are you ever going to tell us about that? So I thought, yeah, I should tell you sort of my whole path. And the freaking Jesus part, well, first of all, the Wineskin, it was like, this cannot not be used as a title. It's a beautiful title, and that was what we called ourselves. Our group was the Wineskin group, and it's like, it's such a beautiful word. So that was a done deal. Whatever comes out after that, the book is Wineskin. And
so
then,
by wineskin, you're talking about putting old wine in new bottles or new wineskins, et
yeah,
cetera.
that's right. That was the impetus of the name of this group of Jesus people. You know, it's more polite to say Jesus people now. But Jesus freak was a pretty common thing back then. Now, freaking Jesus in the 60s and 70s, I think it's a very edgy title, because freaking has a different connotation and adjectival sense now. I was just using it in a gerund sense. We were freaking Jesus. And there was some pushback from the proprietors at Signature saying, are you sure you want to use that? Is that going to put people off? And I responded something to the effect of, I wanted to kind of put people off in that I want them to be alerted to, this is not, you know, the pathway, you know, the road not taken or whatever. This is, we were freaking, you know, and freaky was a great a value that, you know, you freak out. By the way, even people like John Denver would use the term freak out, you know, and that was a good thing, a positive thing. So whatever moss the word has gathered since then, it seemed like the right thing to say. We were freaking Jesus, and in the 60s and 70s, and that made it sort of smear into the whole of the 70s, which I hadn't originally intended. But I thought, well, yeah, I was still doing it later on. I've mentioned some people this anecdote just a couple of years ago. Well, maybe more than that because of the pandemic, but we were in an elders quorum, and they had a, you know, introductory meeting They assign different people, rotate through the quorum, and they asked me to present my history. And I showed a lot of pictures and referred to myself as I was kind of a hippie Jesus freak back then. And one of the brethren said, "You're still a hippie Jesus freak." And, I appreciate that. And I think that you can't get it out of your system. That was just, it was slow dripped into me for so long at the so-called formative years of adolescence that it's never left. And I think that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints benefits a lot from my being in it and around it and bringing those sensibilities, which are described a lot in the book, to the table.
That's great. Do you want to read a passage to us?
Okay, I'll read maybe a short one. As I mentioned earlier, it's hard to, because this book it's like a toddler. It's like saying, "Do you have any great quotes from your toddler?" It's like, well, I have a lot of great quotes, from our 43-year-old daughter, etc. But so I haven't yet habituated myself to, oh, here's the good parts to read. So I'm always interested in things that people suggest. Oh, what about this passage? So on. One that you suggested is just this one paragraph, and I will be reading, I hope, a little bit more from it in the 7 o'clock session later, but I'm going to switch out glasses here. I'm at that, which power of reading glasses do you require at any given moment, and what's the font size? So this is referring, well, maybe I'll go back a little bit.
What page are you on?
I'm on 188. So I'm just talking about when I was working as a janitor, as a student at BYU, and I was writing a prose then, and a little bit of poetry, writing music. I was a music major. All my degrees are in music composition. And so this gives a little sense of the tone and the flavor, if I can use that term, of the prose in the book. How illuminating it is about anything, I don't know, but it does suggest some good things about my process as a writer and as a musician in a larger sense. And by the way, musician in a larger sense is a way of saying being a writer is part of being a musician in a larger sense. Okay. My janitorial job was the greenhouse for both scholarship and creativity. 4 hours of pushing a vacuum cleaner down hallways, scrubbing baseboards, wiping off elevator button plates, etc., freed my mind to write papers, short stories, and even the occasional poem. Music, too. I'd lay sections out in my mind, concoct rhythms, assemble pitch collections, and even invent new experimental ideas for compositions. Being forced to do mindless labor freed me to do mindful labor. I looked forward every day to that afternoon shift where I could process in my head all I'd been injected with before noon. So that was such an important time for me, the janitorial work, to do exactly what it says there. I'm glad to not be doing it anymore. And there's other ways to get at those things, but that unstringing of the bow, to use the metaphor that even Joseph Smith used, is essential. You can't keep it tightened all the time. And so this would allow the free play, as Kant said, the free play of the imagination to take place. And that still goes on. And to me, it's all musical, it's all rhythm and color and tone and form. That I don't know what else there is in creation. I mean, Jackie, look at her work, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
It's the, I mean, I'm looking at rhythm and color and tone and form.
So I had a question prepared, and maybe this is a good point to introduce it.
Sure.
A question about composition. In our email exchange, you said something to the effect that poets and music professors teach composition, and you said that a good interview is a kind of composition, right? And we're always gathering things and recombining them.
Yeah.
I was wondering, is that one of the bedrock principles that informs the way you would teach music composition in the classroom? Anyway, I was just wondering if you could riff a bit on that process and how you share this. Earlier you introduced mindless, mindful, and so forth. How does all of that work when you're trying to share the craft and the tradition with somebody else?
I'm not sure how it works. There's always the pursuit of a kind of self alchemy. So you have these different elements, and somehow you think you're going to come out with a precious metal at the end, but it is an experimentation. Now, over time, as far as teaching is concerned, 35 years at BYU as a music professor, I worked out my material pretty well, and I would always try to add new things in and so on. But it was really a matter of reaching the state where I had the sleight of hand, the mental sleight of hand, to perform with students, and how I would make one move to the next. I always knew what the next thing in their mind was. I go back to William James's talks to teachers, like the turn of the last century. Teaching, he said, is two minds, one thought. And to craft your thinking, your explication of anything technical, historical, moral, even, is figuring out how to have that sort of experience. Two minds, one thought. Hopefully a larger group of minds having a similar thought. But I'm not sure that I'm addressing your question, but even this conversation, I hope that there's a teacherly aspect to it, that we're teaching each other, and hopefully people who are listening in, that it's all improv, of course. That's our whole lives, and it's all how to find the right ending. Because that's, if you're talking about Mormonism, that's what it's all about, is finding, how do you end this? Where do you end up? And so let me actually, since Psalms were brought up earlier, I pulled this Psalm out. So this is Psalm 777. Okay, sounds very biblical, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But I was doing a Psalm a day. I did 1,000 of them, and then I called it quits for a variety of reasons. And I'm going through them now, and shuffling through and trying to collate them and come up with a few hundred, maybe 300, maybe 365, a Psalm a day, kind of a book. But this is Psalm 777, and I'm reading it partly to just show this is sort of current things that I'm doing that are unpublished, other than in the virtual realm of Facebook. But so switch glasses again. So Psalm 777. In the middle of each day, Jesus found another day, like the hole woven into a fishing net, where, as in the rainbowed scales of the tilapia, one could see visions, feel rivers of afterlife sliding through calendars, hear rocks only in their watery singing amid streams you could toss seeds into, and every dead paradise would rise again. Its trees multiplied by new equations the world didn't deserve, but solved anyway.
Wow, that's great.
So I think, that it's one sentence. It's just one sentence. But I love the circuitous path it takes, the linkage of one thing to the next, and then it's like, okay, this is right. This, you know, this is, they're multiplied by equations the world didn't deserve but solved anyway. That little something there is, that's where it's like, okay, I feel that's the right ending. Merrill Bradshaw, one of my teachers in composition, taught a class, Music 395, musicianship integration. That's a whole other discussion. I team taught it with him for a while, but it was required of all students. But his whole thing was the gesture, and he's doing this with his hands. It's the gesture. And you'd say, well, what do you mean the gesture? And he'd say, it's just the. And I had a great when I was studying Renaissance music at University of Illinois, Herbert Kellman, very fine musicologist there and specialist in the Renaissance. He was teaching a class in Heinrich Schutz's music. You probably don't know his music. He's actually an early Baroque composer. But for some reason, Kellman felt that Heinrich Schütz and Georges de la Tour, the painter, had something deeply in common. And whenever you'd ask, well, what is it? And he'd show, because he'd show the paintings, we'd listen to the music, and he could only do this with his fingers. He'd go, it's just the.
Yeah, I love it.
So I think we're all pursuing, as saints, hopefully adequate saints, as writers, as creators of whatever sort. We're looking for that ending, that final brushstroke, for Jackie, or whatever application or something to the canvas. We're looking for that moment of knowing that, the famous quote of Paul Valery, a poem is never finished, only abandoned. But that the perfect moment of abandonment is the quest.
Yeah, and I think if we were to try to bring our critical faculties to bear on that poem, we could say a few things. I mean, the success of those last lines will escape us, but there's a turn there, right? Or from the Italian sonnet, there's a volta, where things that have been introduced come to a culmination of sorts. And it seems to me that one thing you're doing in that poem is balancing different kinds of time, earthly time versus eternal time. And that last image draws them together in a way that is pretty hard to resist. I mean, there's a subtle rhetoric to it, but you just get to the end and you leave the reader wanting a little bit more. That's always a success. If you leave them with too much, then you need to do some cutting. Right?
Absolutely. Well, so and this again, it starts in the middle of each day. Jesus found another day, and then it's like the whole woven into a fishing net, which of course ties a few things together, pun intended, I guess. But and so so let's go into that, and then it's all these other things, and that's how it's sort of that's the lake that it falls into at the end.
Let me follow up, if I may. I remember one time I was teaching a workshop in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, and there was a woman who was a lapsed nun of sorts. So she started out in a convent but left. She always had a kind of worshipful nature, but felt that she could not ever articulate a conventional prayer. But she was prayerful, or most prayerful, when she was gardening. And she was writing an essay about this phenomenon. I guess I'm wondering, is this practice of writing a psalm a day that kind of worshipful practice? I mean, clearly it's literary, it's formal, it's doing other kinds of things, but does it allow you to give thanks, break bread, etc.? It
was exactly that. And I miss it, but I knew it's like, okay, I have to do other things now,
Sure.
But and maybe I'll go back to it at some point, I don't know, but it became a very sacred time to do that involved a certain kind of breathing beforehand, and usually starting with a word I'd run across somewhere, or a phrase, or a way of linking words or something in some other place, prose, poetry, and it's like, okay, I'm starting with that, and then just seeing what will sort of flow in. But it was literally sitting down for within an hour's time, most of the time. Just
I love that.
It evolved to that, certainly. It was more labored before that, or things might be on my mind a day or two ahead or something. And of course it was a beautiful thing to have this Facebook experience. That it just sounds awful to say now in some ways because of the sort of corruption and corrosiveness of Facebook in other regards, but to know that there were people, there's a few, who looked forward to this. It was part of their daily ritual to read this new thing. And sometimes it just was, they would say, oh, that's just what I needed today. And so I was having a kind of ministerial experience.
I like that.
In sharing it. So there was the writing process, which was a personal ritual, but that direct communication. So immediate, here's this thing. I made you this loaf, as Andy Davis would do, and some are better than others,
Yeah.
And that's another thing that was beautiful to learn, and is a great thing to learn by writing, is just, sometimes you get lucky.
Yeah.
You just get lucky. And I think of who was it? Bill Moyers interviewed what's her name, that was married to Donald Hall, that passed away. Do you know? Remember the poet?
Jane Kenyon.
Jane Kenyon. Yes, thank you. And she wrote the poem "Let Evening Come," one of her best known. And he said, she read it on this broadcast. He's doing a bunch of poets or writers, in a series, and she read it. And he said, "Where did that come from?" And she said, "From the Holy Spirit." I thought, what an answer, because at a certain point, you just get lucky or blessed. But it's luck. It's like, where does any word come from in your head? They're just sort of out there flashing in your ears and mind.
Let me move to maybe a corollary inquiry. Your citation mentions that in many circles you're considered the authority on the history of Mormon music. One thing, and you've written some 6 books by my count, depends how you count them, on music, and at least 3 on more, how would you describe them, biographies or histories and so forth. Most recently, the history of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir with Illinois. So one thing that I and others have noted is that these books are eminently readable, and often this kind of book seems as if it's written out of duty, like we need to gather these matters into one place where they can all be looked at in one glance. Yeah. But there's a kind of ease, a kind of pleasure. You were talking earlier about style and I suppose being the handmaiden of content or something like that. How does it work in a book length endeavor like that, where you're more obligated to fact? How do you keep the writing light and entertaining, and to give the reader that same sort of feeling that they're reading a poem, let's say? Yeah. I won't say it's difficult, because that has a bit of bragginess about it, I suppose. But I love the detective work, and a lot of people don't. So I really love plowing into things. And you mentioned in an earlier correspondence this Doors thing, that I've done this. The Doors thing. We need about 2 hours to talk about that.
And so, but I love the prowling into things. I'll mention, like, for example, with the Henry Cowell book, I was working on a study of John Cage's studies with Arnold Schoenberg. And I was at the Schoenberg Institute. And I got the Henry Cowell file because I knew that Cowell had recommended that Cage, or Schoenberg, I guess, had recommended the Cage study with Cowell, something like that. I should remember this now. But so I got the Henry Cowell file, and there was a letter recommendation from Arnold Schoenberg for Henry Cowell. And on the back of it in pencil, it said, written to help get Henry Cowell out of prison. And I thought, I didn't know he'd gone to prison. And so I start looking it up. And in the typical, this was in many places, but in the sort of standard Dictionary of American Musical Biography, it said that he had been arrested on a morals charge, quote unquote, and in the late 1930s, and that the prosecuting attorney had discovered that he was innocent and petitioned the governor to pardon him. So this is where I have the advantage as a detective. I got the original court documents, found the name of the prosecuting attorney, looked him up in the Redwood City phone book, and phoned him up. And he said, "Are you serious?" I'd never heard he was pardoned. I have never had any doubt about his guilt. And so, and this person had gone from prosecutor to a judge. So he was like, what? And so at that moment, that began me searching into, okay, what really happened here? And that became an article that won a lot of attention and an award, and then eventually led to a book on Henry Cowell up through his prison years, essentially. So I love that part of it because I'm doing the memory palace decoration in my mind. Okay, so here are all these things. What's the feng shui of these in my mind? And if I'm designing a narrative, it's the same thing. I do think that as far as the prose style, I learned a thing, again, offhand, you discover things. And there was some talk with Arthur Henry King many, many years ago. And it was a film, maybe it was a film about him, I don't remember. But he was talking about Schoenberg and the number, about Shakespeare. And well, that was pretty. And cutting the number of syllables. How much can you get in the least number of syllables? I mean, this is old hat for you, but for me, it was like, oh my gosh. And so I realized, a lot of times the people I work with, and I discovered this as an editor later of the Journal of American Music, people are really into multiplying syllables to subtract meaning. It makes no sense. So I do work on that a lot. How can I be brief in just the number of is there a word that's adequate and probably better that's shorter in number of syllables? I mean, again, it's old hat to you, but it was a real revelation to me.
Prepositional phrases, nominalization, they're the enemy.
Yeah.
Most bureaucrats, most professors don't know that.
Yeah. So whether it's in music, or I have a piece that people can listen to on YouTube, or actually on my website, michaelhicks.org, I have a piece called Stations of the Cross. And it's very pared down. It's like Stations of the Cross, not as a narrative, but like shards of stained glass, maybe would be one way of describing a lot of it. So it's very inferential. And this, I feel the same way about prose writing, so on. But I think of Marianne Moore. Again, you're probably thinking, tell me something that I don't know. But her thing about poetry that what is it? I too dislike it,
right?
But reading it with a perfect contempt for it, one discovers in it, after all, a place for the genuine, and I love that truth. That's what I'm looking at in these historical books, what's the genuine thing here? What is the truth of this that's authentic? And how do these details that are sort of culled together from, I had trouble with the Henry Cowell book because the archives were closed to me and to other researchers, and so I had to be very cagey for a long time. And then right before I had the book done, and then they suddenly opened the archives because his widow died and so on. So it was kind of fun, but it's the same pursuit as everything, it's just, but you're starting with a set of objects instead of a bare room. Because when you're writing a poem, the blank page is your bare room. When you're writing a historical narrative, you're searching out all of these objects. You're gathering all this furniture and decorations and piling them up in a room, and then it's like, okay, which ones stay in the room and how are they arranged once they're in there?
I love your metaphors here. Most people would content themselves with, well, I have intellectual curiosity, which we all have, but you express that as prowling, as detective work.
It's gumshoe business, man.
Clandestine about it and secret, right?
Yeah.
I like that. And then when you try to explain your process, you mentioned feng shui and the memory palace and shards of glass. These are all really telling metaphors, I think. So clearly, it was great to hear you express this, because I think that attention to those kinds of concerns express themselves in the style in which you write. So I appreciate that. I did want to touch a little bit on one book that we haven't mentioned.
Hey, can I just stop
go ahead.
1 second and say, in this process, I do, in writing the historical and biographical books, I do really respond to resistance. That if I feel abrasion, in the archival world coming back at me, it's like, oh yes, because I get energy from the abrasion. The friction is the point.
I love that. That's great.
So there's that aspect too. So that was certainly the case with the Tabernacle Choir book, and even earlier with the Mormonism and Music book. It was like, wow, there's a lot of resistance here. That tells me I'm on the right path.
Right, exactly. Yeah, even with poems, I'm always telling the students, where's the tension in this poem?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
The opposite spice, where's the conflict?
I had to, again, you want to go on, but I'll mention you a really important thing for me, really important to my musical composition, but these other things as well. And it's expressed in your work and your teaching and what you just said about writing poetry. We had a visitor, Joseph Tal, an Israeli composer, visit University of Illinois years ago. And he made this statement that has informed and insinuated itself into everything since. He says, I have to do it in his voice, every composition must begin with a contradiction. And not everyone would agree with that. But I said, oh, that works for me. It's Hegelian in a way, I suppose, the thesis, antithesis, and work it out. But I would teach students this way. I would say, okay, you want to write a piece, you can do it right now with nothing, okay? Tell me something, to do on the piano. Simple, I do it. And then I'd say, now give me the opposite of that musically. And then I'd do that. I'd say, now listen to what happens. And I'd play the one and I'd play the other one. And then I'd play a variant on the first one, a tiny variant, and then the second one twice. And you could do that. And suddenly the whole thing is just unfolding from a simple compositional point of view in music. Anyway, I do want to go back to you were going.
I love that.
With
you've set this up for a better question, I think. So maybe your most unusual published work so far is, see if I have the title right here, the street legal version of Mormon's book.
Yeah,
that's certainly built on a contradiction in language registers, let's say.
Yeah.
Of course, it's not merely a translation. I was wondering, when I've read pieces of it, I thought of it as a kind of midrash, even though you're going mostly verse to verse. It's also a kind of commentary, isn't it? I was wondering,
Oh, yeah.
would you agree with that? If not, what is it? How would you name this quite anomalous piece of work? Or what genre is it besides translation?
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it, and I think even in the preface disclaim it as a translation per se.
Right.
And I hadn't thought of it as a midrash, but it definitely is a commentary. Now, here's how it began. We had a bishop who, like many bishops, would set a goal for the ward, or sometimes for the young people, but usually for the whole ward. Read the Book of Mormon again, he would say, in the next 4 months or 6 months, whatever it is, He'd set a date, and I'd never read the Book of Mormon except once, right before I joined the church, and I really had problems with it because I was so steeped in the Bible and the New Testament, and the anachronistic and I won't say plagiaristic, but the sort of siphoning in of phrases from Paul, into the pre-Christian era, for example, that kind of thing. It wasn't for me. I started with Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith. That was my entree into Mormon doctrine. And then I got into Doctrine and Covenants and lots of other books. And I described that in Wineskin, of course. But so I'd never read the Book of Mormon again. And I thought, okay, I don't want to sit around feeling guilty once more, or at least I need to find another way of feeling guilty. So another means to guilt. So I thought, okay, I'm going to do it, but I can only do it if I get to rewrite it. And so I literally copied the whole Book of Mormon into a Word document, just copy and paste. And then I went verse by verse and rewrote it. And when I say rewriting it, a lot of it was marginalia. A lot of it was, okay, let me explain this to you, as though I were in the voice of, pseudepigraphic in that way, I suppose, as though I were the author whose name is attached to a book and so on. That was the whole sum and substance of it. And there was no revision at all, other than a little here and there, as I'm going along. Oh yeah, that kind of thing. But when the whole was done, it was like, I don't want anyone to review this. I don't want anyone to say, oh, it needs more of this or less of that. And there are people that read it and said, some really testy comments on Facebook, but some admiring ones too. But it's like, that was it for me. That's why I was doing it. I published it myself. I thought people will find things in this. And I was really pleased the other day to see in Michael Austin's review of Wineskin, he refers to street legal, the SLV, we call it. And he used the term endlessly fascinating. And I thought that's a really sweet way of putting it. But I haven't ever gone back to it, or, other than to put it together and, working on typography and so on. But that was the origin and the sum and substance of it. But I think I'll pull it out every now and then. I shouldn't say I never go back to it, but just sort of flip it over. It's like, well, this is interesting, this part here. The ruminations, so the midrashic aspects. Yeah. But that's the only value. It's not a rewrite for people to substitute or anything. It's just saying, here's a sidebar, a big fat sidebar to this other book.
Here's another way to think about it, perhaps.
Yeah.
I have a former student, Shannon Castleton, who once said that when she creates her universe, the rules of authorship will be altered slightly. So if you're a remarkable reader of a work, then you get credit for producing that work, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a move from, I guess, a writerly world to a readerly world. So we could say the Book of Mormon or Mormon's book by Mormon and Michael Hicks, because yours was such a strong misreading or rereading of
Yeah.
his work, I suppose.
Yeah.
So this is an indulgent question, and I
Sure.
hope you don't mind entertaining it. I
No.
know at certain points you've been called as a word organist, and you, from what all indications, brought new meaning to prelude and postlude music, bringing in how would you say, homages to popular music or other kinds of symphonies and classical and so forth. So I was wondering if you could just comment on that and maybe talk about the way that has maybe brought more pleasure to you or maybe gotten you into trouble, invited people to listen more carefully to the prelude.
Yeah, there's prelude and postlude, both of which are obligato. That's a musical term for the whole cacophony symphony taking place in people visiting one another. So it's a very old tradition, certainly going back to Martin Luther in the Protestant realm, but going back for centuries and centuries, to take a popular tune and write sacred music to it. The Lomar May masses of Ockeghem and Josquin de Prez and so on, talk about in the 15th and 16th centuries. So there was an old tune, Loma, Loma, Lomar May, Lomar May, Lomar May, joie tendue te, you know, that's the tune. And they would embed that. This was a big thing that all these composers were doing. They would embed that in their masses and so on. And it was a sacralize. It was a way of sacralizing, I think. Well, Luther took just flat out tunes that everybody knew that were folk tunes or popular music. It wasn't really a genre of popular as such then, but you know what I'm saying, the people's music, vernacular music, and turned them into hymns and chorales. So I'm just tapping into that tradition, but doing it, as was often done for centuries, by linking the text associated, or maybe something else associated with the music, the songs, I should say, because they were always vocal pieces, so they were songs. And I do it in a neo-Baroque style. It would be embedded in there. It would not be flat out, except I'll give you a couple of quick examples. Because I needed to do that for myself. I wasn't doing it for the congregation, although there were a few in the congregation that started to figure out what was going on. And by the way, this practice has spread from me and my posting of these to congregations around the country. And so I've had people saying, oh, listen to this. Recently, I had a friend, I think in Arizona, who was playing me his prelude, and you could hear everyone talking around it. And he's playing REM's Everybody Hurts in the background. It's like, what a beautiful hymn. So I played, I'll give you two quick examples. One that was sort of a jokey one, but it was perfect. I played you make it slow and soft and put a little counterpoint ornamentation in there. You can do anything, you know, you can transform any piece into a sacred sounding piece, particularly on the pipe organ in our case. And so we had a young women's day. They were all speaking, you know, all the young women leaders and so on. And I played a slow, reverent version of Madonna's Like a Virgin. and it was, and again, these are on YouTube, you can check them out, but and then it was a medley too. So it was hinged to the Bobby Fuller 4 song, I Fought the Law and the Law Won. So there were those two. So that was one that was sort of a sneering look, you know. But on other occasions, for example, on a Mother's Day, actually multiple Mother's Days, I would play, somewhere embedded in this, I would play Let It Be, the Beatles. And on one case, I would just have it sort of hooked to There Is Beauty All Around. So it's a kind of a medley of the two. as a prelude. But in one case, I just played as postlude Let It Be, just so obviously the Beatles song. You know the song, right? When I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me speaking words of wisdom, let it be. And there were a few people that kind of looked at me and nodded and didn't say anything. One sister came up and she just said, best Mother's Day song ever. And I thought, you're right. I'll give you one other example. Sorry to belabor this, but it was another ritualized pursuit of mine for a long time. I played as postlude Bridge Over Troubled Water. And the music chairman at the time, a pious and quite intelligent woman, but rigorous in her approach to handbookiness, I might say, handbookishness. And she said, oh, so we're playing the Beatles in church now? And I said, that's not the Beatles. That's Simon Garfunkel. That's Paul Simon, Bridge Over Troubled Water. And she said, well, you need to focus on the hymns. And I said, in what sense is Bridge Over Troubled Waters not a hymn? And she said, and it's true. I mean, if ever there was a hymn, and I actually talk about this in another video on YouTube, I've talked about, because I was raised when that song was new with the notion that the three verses of that depict a relationship to Christ in which you're weary, you come to him, and then you're dealing with things. And then the last verse, sail on, silver girl, sail on by. Your time to come your time to shine has come. All your dreams are on the way. So it's saying, okay, you go out onto the river yourself. I'm not the bridge anymore. You sail on. It's a fantastic gospel message, I think. So anyway, that was a beautiful several year period. And I have, if anyone wants, I've got a PDF where I wrote down each of the things that I did, because I posted them on Facebook. Here's what I did today and why I did it and how I did it and so on. And there are links to YouTube recordings of many of them. So,
that's remarkable. We're almost out of time. Maybe we have time for one final question. What's next, or what are you in the middle of?
Well, I was afraid and certain you were going to ask that. So, but
not that you need to be in the middle of something. Maybe you need a rest.
Yeah, give me a break, man. Well, I'm working on another book right now, actually, about my 4 years at University of Illinois as a Mormon avant-gardist. And it's a difficult thing to work on a book knowing it's not going to be as good as the previous book. I know that. And so how can I make it good in a different way? Going back to that word good. So that there's not necessarily a comparison, but it's a memoir kind of thing. I'm collating the Psalms, but most of what I do is the sort of afterclap of teaching in really wonderful ways. And I always point when people say he's a retired professor, I say, no, I'm an emeritus professor. I'm the sagacious guy that people will come to and ask for help with it. Oh, could you review this? So earlier today, you and I were corresponding a little bit, and I got an email from a young woman who's working on a paper that I gave her some research materials on. She says, I've done the paper. Will you read? Are you still willing to read it? So there's a lot of that kind of stuff. There's reviewing manuscripts for book publishers, sometimes journal article publishers, and just different kinds of consultations, sometimes with respect to how do you handle this at BYU? There's a lot of that. How do I deal with this situation and so on, that you as an administrator, of course, are in the deep, flavorless milkshake of all the time. So,
but only for 2 more months.
Oh, really? Okay. So things. So I'm asked to do this. I'm doing a presentation for a group of IT people at BYU, for example. They're having me come and talk about what's happening with the new hymn book and how do you compile a hymn book and what are the issues involved. So just there's always little things to do, plus ministerial work at Jamestown. And so I love the emeritus status, and I love being paid to not be at BYU. That's a wonderful thing. You'll get there.
Well, that's a great place to end, though I'm sorry that we have to end. Thank you for your graciousness and
Thank you.
and value. No obligation here. I was just happy to enter the flow and follow you along. Appreciate that.
Well, thanks so much. It was a real pleasure. I hope it was a pleasure for the
eavesdroppers.
The eavesdroppers, exactly.
Thank you. And well deserved this citation.
Thank you so much.